You've probably heard that phrase running amok, right?
Yeah.
And maybe,
Yeah.
you've used it yourself for something chaotic like a toddler in a toy store or just a really crazy meeting.
Yeah, it happens all the time.
But what if I told you that this common saying, it actually has this really dark, um, deep historical root. It comes from this ancient, honestly unsettling state of like furious attack,
Yeah.
often leading to devastating killing sprees.
Hmm.
It's way more than just things getting a bit out of hand. It's a terrifying look into the extremes of human behavior.
That's absolutely right. And on today's deep dive, that's really our mission,
Huh.
to sort of peel back the layers of this fascinating, but yeah, chilling concept.
Okay.
We're going to take you on a journey exploring the complex history, the cultural evolution, the psychological stuff underneath, and how Amok and, related acts of targeted violence show up today.
Where are we getting this info?
We're pulling from a whole stack of sources. We've
Mhm.
got historical accounts going back centuries, modern forensic studies, detailed analyses from places like the U.S. Secret Service.
Okay. Solid stuff.
Yeah. So by the end of this, you'll get a really thorough understanding, we hope, of what truly drives these devastating events and, maybe most importantly, how we might actually, prevent them. So let's get into it.
Okay, so we've touched on this chilling idea of amok, but to really grasp it, we need to go back, like way back to its earliest roots. Where does this intense thing actually start?
Well, its origins are really deeply embedded in Southeast Asian culture, specifically the Malay archipelago.
Okay.
The word amok itself, it comes straight from the Malay word amok.
Amok?
Yeah, amok. And it literally means a frenzied, furious state of attack, often, like you said, leading to a killing spree. It describes the state where someone, or sometimes even a whole group, just suddenly enters this violent rage, attacking anyone, really, until they're either killed or, stopped somehow.
Wow. And what's really wild is that this isn't just like a one-off thing found in one place, is it? When you look at history, you see parallels.
Oh, absolutely. You definitely can. The most direct one, probably the most vivid, is the Norse berserker gang.
Ah, the Vikings.
Exactly, the Viking warriors entering that battle trance. Both Amok and berserker gang, they describe these really intense psychophysical states. Meaning like the mind and body are just working together in this extreme way. It lets people do extraordinary things, feel kind of invulnerable in a fight.
No pain, no fear.
Pretty much. Maybe no pain, no fear, showing almost superhuman strength, endurance. But colonial observers, when they saw this, they often totally misinterpreted it.
How's that?
Well, they just saw the violence, right?
Uh-huh.
And they chalked it up to like insanity or being drunk or some kind of madness. What they missed, because of their Western viewpoint, was the whole cultural picture,
Right.
the spiritual discipline, the training, and often these underlying acts of real self-sacrifice or duty that were part of these warrior traditions.
That misinterpretation sounds really key. Because early on, amok wasn't just seen as some random madness. History shows there was a more organized, almost strategic understanding of it locally, right?
Precisely, yeah. Like Captain Cook, back in his 1770 journals, he wrote that amok was a, quote, frequent and long-standing behavior among Malaysians. One of his officers even said there was scarcely a week when he was not called upon to capture a pengamok. That's a person in an amok state.
Wow, every week.
Yeah, so it wasn't just some rare thing. It was common enough and disruptive enough that the colonial authorities were constantly dealing with it. And even more telling, during those Dutch VOC ship rebellions in the 1780s,
Right?
Balinese slave laborers would actually scream amok to kick off a violent uprising against the Dutch.
So it's a signal, a call to arms.
Exactly. Not just one person losing it, but a coordinated cry. It shows they understood amok way earlier as this organized, really scary threat to the colonials, not just some individual breakdown.
Okay, so it starts as this organized threat signal. But the understanding definitely changed as more people observed it.
It did. By 1901, this British physician, John D. Gimlet, who studied conditions in Malaysia a lot, he gave a more specific definition that really stuck.
What did he say?
He described amok as an acute outburst of unrestrained violence, associated with homicidal attacks, preceded by brooding, and ending with exhaustion and amnesia.
Brooding, violence, exhaustion, amnesia. That sounds familiar.
Right. That definition is so important because it nails those core elements we still recognize today in, acts of targeted violence, the brooding period, that explosive violence, and then the crash afterwards. mentally and physically.
And culturally, where did the Malays pick this up?
Well, originally, the Javanese and Malays adopted it from Hindu states in India, mostly for warfare. They'd scream Amok on the battlefield, not just as a war cry, but to really put the fear of God into their enemies.
Primal fear.
Exactly. And it was even seen back in the 14th century as this act of intense religious fanaticism, people embracing a frenzied suicidal charge for spiritual reasons. So yeah, right from the start, it was tied up with both spirituality and fighting, almost like a sacred self-sacrificial act.
So it starts as this powerful, maybe even heroic or religious thing, this battle trance, and then there's this huge shift, the 19th century colonial powers expanding. That really changed how Amok was seen, didn't it?
Oh, big time. That's when the transformation really kicks in.
They got worried about public order.
Deeply worried, and that led directly to its medicalization. What was seen internally, as maybe courage or spiritual fervor or even noble sacrifice, started getting systematically reframed by Europeans as just madness.
And that serves a purpose for them.
Absolutely. It was a colonial tool, really. It let them pathologize behavior that challenged their control. Instead of dealing with, say, a legitimate uprising or a cultural act of defiance, they could just dismiss it as mental illness. And that justified cracking down hard using European laws.
Makes sense in a grim way.
Yeah. A classic example is this English doctor, Denny's, in 1894. He defined Amok as, quote, a form of psychosis peculiar to Malaysians.
Peculiar to Malaysians, wow.
Right. That's not just clinical. It's loaded with cultural bias. It implies this could only happen in those exotic Eastern societies. It reinforces that whole narrative of Western superiority, Western rationality.
And then the medical theories just kind of exploded, didn't they? Trying to pin it on anything and everything.
Oh, completely. It reflects this scramble to fit it into Western boxes to control it. The medical literature attributed Amok to this incredibly wide, often contradictory range of things.
Like what?
Well, early on, you had doctors like Thomas Oxley in the 1800s talking about demonic possession, but then concluding it was caused by gastritis.
Gastritis.
Seriously. That set a weird trend. They linked it to all sorts of physical stuff, gastroenteritis, fevers, even chickenpox, basically suggesting some bodily illness was driving the rage. Then, as psychiatry developed in the 19th century, the focus shifted. More psychological explanations. Dementia, different kinds of psychosis became the go-to diagnoses as they tried to fit Amok into their new mental illness categories.
And substances? Opium, alcohol?
Yep, they got blamed too. Especially opium, as its production and use grew in the colonies. The number of articles linking opium to Amok went up right alongside its availability.
Interesting correlation.
And even though alcohol wasn't common in Islamic society, the increased European presence meant more locals encountered it, leading to more alcohol-related incidents being labeled Amok. It all just shows this constantly shifting attempt to understand or maybe misunderstand this foreign thing using Western ideas, often projecting their own issues onto it.
And this whole concept, once it was labeled a pathology, it even seeped into Western culture, right? Like that Stefan Zweig novella, Amok.
Yeah, the 1922 novella.
Yeah.
That's a perfect example of how the Western mind kind of absorbed and reinterpreted it, often mixing it with its own ideas, like early Freudian theories about repression.
So for decades, it was seen as what they called a culture-bound syndrome, something unique to certain society.
Exactly. That was the dominant idea, that it was so tied to a specific culture, it couldn't really exist anywhere else. It even got into the DSM-IV, the big manual of mental conditions in the U.S.
Like it was this exotic, localized thing.
Right. These culture-bound syndromes, they were seen as these folk diagnoses that made sense of certain weird experiences within a specific culture.
But that label itself, culture-bound, has been seriously challenged, hasn't it?
Yeah.
Because for something to be truly culture-bound, it has to be fundamentally tied only to that culture, not found anywhere else.
That is the absolute core of the counter-argument. Psychiatrists like Pao-Meng Yap, way back in 1951, were already questioning this. He carefully pointed out that behaviors like Amok, that specific pattern, brooding, homicidal outburst, exhaustion, amnesia, were actually seen all over the world in different forms.
So if you see it elsewhere,
then it's not indispensable to just one culture's way of developing illness, right? The DSM-5, the current version, made a really important shift. It now talks about cultural concepts of distress.
What's the difference?
It acknowledges that while how distress is expressed is definitely shaped by culture, the underlying human vulnerabilities like feeling deeply wronged, intensely humiliated, or just utterly desperate, those are actually universal.
Ah, okay. That makes sense.
Yeah, and that evolution in thinking is crucial. It means we can now see Amok not just as a historical artifact, but as this powerful lens for looking at extreme violence in all societies, including our own.
Okay, so if Amok isn't strictly culture bound, if it's more this universal psychological pattern, what are those shared characteristics? Ones that show up across different cultures. What's the underlying pattern here?
Well, at its absolute core, amok-like behavior involves this rapid, often really extreme escalation into violent outbursts. And these outbursts, they're usually way out of proportion to whatever immediately triggered them. And people in these states often seem profoundly detached from reality, just temporarily.
Detached how?
Like they might describe feeling like they're watching themselves from outside their own body, or like their actions aren't really connected to their own will. It lets them do things that are incredibly self-destructive or obviously extremely dangerous to others.
And you mentioned before that explosive violence. There's that buildup, the brooding period. How does that show up universally?
That brooding period is, yeah, it's absolutely critical, no doubt about it. It's this extended time of just internalizing immense distress, like a slow burning fuse.
What kind of distress?
Often it comes from feeling profoundly humiliated or this deep sense of injustice or maybe a major irreparable personal loss.
Hmm.
In the traditional Malay context, like we talked about, this was basically loss of faith, that devastating shame or social disgrace. But in modern settings, it could be anything really. Persistent bullying, extreme social isolation, suddenly losing a job, a really painful breakup, or just feeling constantly overlooked or marginalized.
And then after the violence?
After the violent episode, the person usually just crashes. Extreme physical and mental exhaustion. And what's really striking is they often say they have no memory or only patchy memories of what they did.
The amnesia.
Yeah. And sometimes that's followed by feelings of just deep despair or intense regret. And that amnesia, it's not always, faked. It can be a real neurological thing.
This whole trajectory, the brooding, the escalating distress, then this final, often self-destructive explosion. It sounds frighteningly similar to what we see in a lot of modern targeted violence, like school shootings, workplace attacks, even if we don't call it a market.
You've absolutely hit on a key insight there. Precisely. Modern psychiatry is increasingly seeing these amok-like episodes not as their own separate illness, but as extreme manifestations or acute symptoms of underlying, often severe mental health conditions.
That's a really important distinction.
It is, and it often gets lost in the public discussion. We're talking about things like psychotic disorders, schizophrenia, for instance, especially if there are paranoid delusions where the person thinks they're being persecuted, or command hallucinations where voices tell them to do violent things.
Right.
That can lead to such severe disorganization in thinking and behavior that the violence is almost like a desperate response to those internal experiences or totally distorted perceptions.
So it's not just having a mental illness diagnosis that causes violence, but how certain severe symptoms can play out in these extreme cases.
Exactly. Or think about severe mood disorders, like psychotic depression, where extreme sadness comes with delusions or hallucinations, or severe bipolar disorder during a manic phase, where feelings of grandiosity, impulsivity, irritability are just sky high.
Okay.
These conditions can seriously fuel impulsive, aggressive behavior. The person might feel this overwhelming despair or an unbearable rage, or even this grandiose sense of being right that pushes them towards destruction.
Any others?
Then you have personality disorders, specifically things like antisocial, borderline, or paranoid personality disorders. They often involve chronic anger, severe impulsivity, really intense emotional dysregulation, and this pervasive pattern of distrust or disregard for others. Under stress, especially combined with trauma or substance abuse, these can significantly raise the risk for violent outbursts.
And that amnesia part, the detachment from reality.
Yeah.
How does science explain that now? Is it more than just a psychological break?
Yeah, that often points directly to what are called dissociative states.
Dissociation.
Yeah, a profound disconnection. Thoughts, memories, feelings, even your sense of self just kind of disconnect from your conscious awareness. Like you said, feeling like you're watching yourself from outside or your actions aren't yours. It's a fundamental break in how identity, memory, consciousness, emotion, perception all work together.
And brain scans show this.
They do. Brain imaging studies of dissociation show dysregulation in these interconnected brain areas responsible for emotion, memory, self-awareness. You might see decreased activity in the prefrontal cortex. That's key for judgment, decision-making, emotional control. That leads to that numb feeling or that chilling sense of unreality during the event.
Okay.
You see weird fluctuations in the amygdala, the brain's fear center. Sometimes it's overactive, like during flashbacks. Other times it's oddly underactive during depersonalization, contributing to that lack of emotional response. And problems with the hippocampus, which is crucial for forming memories, can cause fragmented memories or just a complete lack of a coherent story for the violence. That explains the amnesia afterwards.
So the brain kind of shuts down certain functions.
Yeah, this neural shutdown can create that temporary, profound detachment, allowing extreme acts to happen with this chilling lack of conscious awareness because the brain just isn't encoding the event properly.
Are there other biological factors involved beyond these severe mental health conditions, things that might make someone more vulnerable?
Yes, definitely. There are underlying things that can significantly increase vulnerability. Traumatic brain injuries, TBIs, especially to the frontal or temporal lobes, the parts governing impulse control, executive function, emotional regulation, they come up frequently.
Right.
Certain forms of epilepsy, particularly temporal lobe epilepsy, are known to sometimes cause sudden behavioral changes, rage episodes, or automatisms, these automatic repetitive behaviors done unconsciously.
Yeah.
And there can be genetic predispositions too, affecting brain development or function in those key areas, making someone subtly more susceptible to mental health issues or impulse control problems when they face major stress.
In substances.
Oh, absolutely. Substance abuse plays a huge and acute role. It directly alters brain chemistry, severely messes with judgment, lowers inhibitions. Alcohol, certain drugs, they can directly trigger or worsen these neurological dysregulations. It significantly doubles the risk of violence, even for people without pre-existing conditions.
So it really is this complex web. There was that neurologist, Dr. Jonathan Pincus, who studied violence. He had a pretty stark way of putting it, didn't he?
He did, and his words really resonate here. Pincus famously argued, violence is ultimately about brain function. It's a behavioral symptom, not a disease, that is most often found in people with histories of brain injury or mental illness.
A symptom, not the disease itself.
Exactly. He suggested violent criminal behavior is the catastrophic product of a dysfunctional brain coupled with an abusive environment. That multi-causal view is so crucial. We can't just point to one thing. It's usually this convergence of biological vulnerabilities, often rooted in early trauma or injury, meeting profoundly distressing social and environmental factors that just push someone over the edge.
Now, here's a really striking, often disturbing pattern in these kinds of incidents, especially spree killings. Why are they almost always carried out by men? That gender disparity seems almost universal.
It is incredibly striking, yeah. And evolutionary psychology offers some, well, compelling perspectives, though they can be uncomfortable to discuss. Let's first maybe clarify a concept. Spite. In this context, spite means an act where everybody loses, the perpetrator and the target. It often ends with the killer's own death, either suicide or suicide by cop.
So it's not about winning, it's about making someone else lose, even if you lose too.
Exactly. It's an extreme form of revenge. The motive is to fix some perceived profound injustice, even if it costs the perpetrator everything. It's not about maximizing your own gain, it's about inflicting a severe cost, even at immense personal expense.
Oh, spite. How does that relate to evolution?
It connects to this idea of relative inclusive fitness. Think of evolution like this high-stakes game across generations. Your score isn't just your own success, but how well you do compared to everyone else in your species, especially in passing on genes.
Right, survival of the fittest, relatively speaking.
Kind of. So yeah, having more kids boosts your direct score. But in a darker evolutionary twist, strategies that effectively reduce your competitor's ability to pass on their genes can also be rewarded by evolution. So this concept suggests that deep down, maybe hardwired, there could be this primal drive not just to win, but to stop others from winning or diminish their success. And that drive, under extreme pressure, could tragically bubble up as something as destructive as spite-driven violence, even if it costs you your life, because it relatively increases your genetic footprint by reducing others.
Okay, that's
Feel right.
a heavy concept.
Yeah.
How does it link specifically to gender, to men?
It ties into something called male reproductive variance. Basically, there's much more variation in how many children men have compared to women. Some men have lots of kids, others have none.
Right.
This biological difference, plus societal pressures, creates this category of reproductively disenfranchised men. Guys who, for whatever reason, maybe social awkwardness, Perceived unattractiveness, lack of resources are less appealing to partners. They find themselves at the low end of the reproductive ladder with maybe bleak future prospects for passing on genes.
So feeling like a failure in that fundamental area could be a massive trigger.
Precisely. We see that spree killings very often happen after a personal rejection by a woman, or this profound sense of social ostracism, or a big public loss of status. Daly and Wilson, in their big 1988 study on homicide, they noted the most common precipitating events are difficulties with wives or girlfriends, losses of face, and losses of money.
All tied to social and reproductive standing.
Exactly. A man feeling utterly defeated in those areas might resort to these extreme, self-destructive acts of spite.
And this links to the higher male suicide rates too,
Yeah.
which are consistently, what, 3 to 4 times higher than women's? Since many spree killings end in the perpetrator's death.
The connection is incredibly strong, yeah. One major evolutionary theory of suicide suggests it's more likely when someone sees their future as totally bleak, feels completely ostracized, and starts seeing themselves as just a burden on their genetic relatives. For men, add in the historical reality of paternity uncertainty, never being 100% sure a child is genetically yours, which might lead men to feel a slightly weaker connection to supposed relatives compared to mothers. Combine that with more men being at that reproductively disenfranchised end, and their perceived bleak future and sense of being a burden can become acutely worse.
It sounds almost like a doomed warrior mentality.
That's actually a very good way to put it. Insightful. Perpetrators of these rampages, often deeply isolated, might literally see themselves as, quote, surrounded by enemies and determined at least to inflict some costs upon them before their own end.
Wow.
It tragically mirrors that male tribal warfare dynamic where fighters are almost always men. The rampage killer, seen this way, is acting out of this extreme nihilistic spite, trying to decrease the relative success and standing of those competitors they feel wronged them, or who represent the success they've been denied, even if it means their own death. It's a tragic, destructive outcome of deep psychological adaptations, just catastrophically amplified by feelings of injustice, despair, and seeing absolutely no future.
Okay, let's shift from those ancient roots and evolutionary patterns to modern rage. How do these amok-like patterns show up today? Specifically in these really disturbing contexts of targeted violence in schools and workplaces. The U.S. Secret Service, through their National Threat Assessment Center, they've put a lot of effort into studying these tragedies. Their big analysis from 2008 to 2017 on targeted school violence gives us some really stark, vital information.
Yeah, it's an incredibly important report, foundational really, for understanding and prevention. It's called Protecting America's Schools, a U.S. Secret Service analysis of targeted school violence.
Okay.
They looked really closely at 41 incidents in K-12 schools, mostly public high schools, about 73% of the cases. And one of the absolute most critical findings, which backs up earlier research too, is that there is no single profile of an attacker.
No profile. That seems counterintuitive.
It does, but it's crucial. Attackers varied hugely. Age, gender, race, grade, social life, they came from everywhere. And same for the schools, big, small, urban, rural, different student-teacher ratios.
Why is that finding so important?
Because it tells us definitively that trying to create a profile or focusing on static traits, it's just not effective. It's often misleading. The focus has to shift to observable behaviors and concerning situations that happen before an attack.
Okay, so less about who they are, much more about what they do leading up to it. Let's get into those common factors among attackers, starting with maybe the most immediate one, weapon access.
Right. The study found most attackers, 76%, used firearms. And here's the really critical part. Overwhelmingly, they got those guns from home.
From home.
Yeah, and very often they were unsecured, not locked up, not kept safely away. While some attackers used knives, the firearm attacks were way more deadly. Like 48% resulted in death compared to only 13% for knife attacks.
That's a huge difference.
It really highlights how much firearms amplify the lethality. So any good threat assessment has to seriously look at access to any weapon, but especially focus immediately on guns in the home. It means having those tough conversations with parents about safe storage.
Makes sense. What about mental health? That always comes up after these events. What did the Secret Service find there?
Yeah, the findings here are really telling, and they really underline how multifaceted this is. The vast majority, 91% of attackers, showed psychological, behavioral, or developmental symptoms before their attacks.
91%. Wow. Can you break that down?
Sure.
Okay.
Psychologically, 63% showed signs of depression, sadness, withdrawal. 60% had suicidal thoughts, showing really deep despair. 29% struggled with anxiety, 26% showed intense uncontrolled anger, and 20% had psychotic symptoms like persecutory delusions, thinking people were out to get them, or hearing voices, maybe telling them to act.
And behavior like.
Behaviorally, 57% showed defiance, poor impulse control, aggression towards others, sometimes even animal cruelty, which is a known red flag. And then neurologically or developmentally, 20% had issues like developmental delays, cognitive problems, learning disabilities, or autism spectrum symptoms. These often lead to big problems with social skills and regulating emotions.
There's a lot going on internally.
A lot. But here's a crucial nuance. Almost half of these attackers had already received some kind of mental health service, often through school or privately.
Really? So treatment isn't always enough.
It tells us that just identifying a mental health issue isn't the whole story. Effective, ongoing intervention and threat assessment are also absolutely necessary. Care is valuable, but it has to be part of a bigger picture.
Okay. Beyond diagnosed conditions, did they have specific interests that were, concerning like violent topics?
Yeah, quite often. About half of the attackers showed a real interest in violent topics.
Like what?
Obsessions with past mass shootings, like Columbine, or with figures linked to extreme violence, like Hitler or Nazism. Sometimes they express these through really disturbing drawings, writings, online posts.
Is that predictive?
Well, an interest alone doesn't automatically mean violence, but when you see it combined with other concerning behaviors, it's definitely a significant red flag that needs immediate attention.
What about stressors? Were there common triggers pushing them?
Absolutely. This was universal. 100% of the attackers experienced significant social stressors.
100%.
Yep. Often related to peer relationships, problems with girlfriends or boyfriends, other conflicts. These stressors frequently popped up in the 6 months before the attack, and disturbingly, for half of them, it was within just 2 days of the attack. That signals a really rapid escalation of distress.
Wow, 2 days?
Yeah. Other common stressors were family fights, school problems, disciplinary issues, personal stuff like money worries. This finding just screams the need for everyone in a school, teachers, counselors, admins to be trained to spot a student in acute crisis. And to understand that seemingly small social rejections can be incredibly destabilizing for someone vulnerable.
Bullying comes up so often it's heartbreaking. How big a factor was that here?
It was profoundly significant. The report found 57%, the majority, were victims of persistent bullying.
Persistent.
Yeah, not just occasional teasing. Chronic stuff. Weeks, months, sometimes years. Verbal abuse, social exclusion, physical attacks, property damage, cyberbullying.
And did people know?
That's the tragic part. Often, yes. Classmates knew in 46% of cases. Parents knew in 46% too. Even school officials knew sometimes, 34% of the time. But the bullying wasn't always dealt with effectively. It really highlights a critical weakness in the system. The need for safe, inclusive school environments where bullying is just not tolerated and where reporting systems actually work and are trusted.
What about their home lives? Any common threads there?
Almost all of them, 94%, experienced negative home life factors. On average, 3.4 factors each.
Like what kind of factors?
Things like parents separating or divorcing, that was 71%. Financial problems in 69%. Family members arrested or incarcerated, 54%. Substance abuse in the home, 46%. Mental illness in the family, 23%.
Yeah.
And a history of the attacker themselves being abused or neglected, also 23%.
So often multiple issues compounding each other.
Exactly. These things aren't direct predictors on their own, but when you have several creating this chronically unstable or distressing environment, they're strongly linked to negative outcomes for kids.
Did these attackers usually have a history of trouble at school? Disciplinary actions?
Yes, most did. 71% had a prior history of school discipline. And alarmingly, in about a third of those cases, 31%, the discipline was specifically for threatening or violent behavior.
So the school knew there was a potential issue.
Often, yes. And the report really emphasizes that just punishing them isn't enough. Kicking a student out, suspension, or expulsion if they pose a risk, it's not always the safest or best option. It can actually make things worse by isolating them more.
So what's the alternative?
The focus needs to be on continued positive engagement, providing support services, using a comprehensive threat assessment process, even during discipline, to make sure the underlying problems get addressed.
It really sounds like there were often clear warning signs, even if people didn't always act on them. That seems critical.
Absolutely critical. This might be one of the most actionable findings. All attackers showed observable concerning behaviors, and these behaviors worried bystanders, friends, family, school staff in 80% of cases.
80%.
And here's the kicker. 83%, the vast majority, explicitly communicated their intent to attack beforehand.
They said something or wrote something.
Yeah, various ways. Verbally threatening people, writing disturbing things in journals or online, making drawings, even recording videos. And 2/3 of them did this within 2 weeks of the attack. It's a clear, imminent danger signal.
But people didn't act. Why not?
The reasons varied. Fear of getting involved or retaliation, disbelief, oh, they wouldn't actually do that, misjudging how serious it was, sometimes even misguided loyalty. It just hammers home the need to train and empower everyone, students, staff, parents, to recognize these signals, trust their gut, and report them through safe channels. Every piece of information matters.
Were these attacks typically impulsive, spur-of-the-moment things? Or planned?
Rarely impulsive. Over half, 51%, engaged in observable planning.
Like what?
Researching weapons, making detailed plans for how they'd carry out the attack, being deceptive to hide what they were doing, even practicing with weapons. And what's really telling, the mass attackers, the ones who hurt 3 or more people, showed twice as many planning behaviors. That indicates more premeditation, more intent for widespread harm.
And this planning happened close to the event.
Often within a month, yeah. Which again provides a potential window for intervention if those planning behaviors are spotted and reported.
Let's talk about the attacks themselves. How did they usually unfold? How long did they last? Where did they happen?
The data paints a really sobering picture. Most attacks were incredibly short. 44% lasted 1 minute or less.
1 minute?
Yeah, and they mostly happened in one spot, 88% in classrooms or right outside them. That short duration means police rarely had time to get there and intervene before serious harm was done. It really emphasizes the need for immediate, on-site responses and, ideally, prevention beforehand.
So if police often couldn't get there in time, how did these attacks end?
Well, about half, 51%, ended without anyone from the outside intervening. Either the attacker committed suicide, that was 17% of cases, or they fled the scene, 15%.
Wow. That underscores that self-destructive element again.
It does. Now, non-law enforcement, school staff, teachers, administrators, security, they actually intervened and stopped the attack in a significant 22% of cases. That highlights their crucial frontline role.
That's huge. What about law enforcement?
Law enforcement intervened in 15% of cases, but that was typically school resource officers already on campus or local police who just happened to be at the school already when it started. Critically, no attacks were ended by outside police agencies responding from off campus. None in this study set. That data just unequivocally shows how vital school staff and people already on site are for early intervention and stopping these events once they start. You can't rely solely on outside emergency response.
This sounds incredibly similar to workplace violence incidents we hear about, too. That Bright Patch report from 2023 on major workplace violence points to so many of the same patterns.
It really does.
Like, that woman charged for allegedly shooting a coworker a Family Dollar after an argument. Or the awful Half Moon Bay shooting in California, where a mushroom farm worker killed 4 people at one farm, then 3 at another nearby, targeting coworkers or former coworkers.
Yes, the parallels are striking. It shows these underlying drivers really do cross different environments. The Bright Path report has tons of examples like that. The guy recently fired from a shipyard in Louisiana coming back to kill 2 ex-coworkers.
Right.
The dispute at a Topgolf in Denver ending in a fatal shooting. The KFC employee in Indiana fired earlier that day, coming back to shoot someone. A former employee at a university firing shots at a current employee over an old argument. The ex-Walmart worker in Indiana wounding a former coworker in a meeting. Even that tragic old National Bank shooting in Louisville, a 25-year-old employee opening fire, killing 5, injuring 8. It fits the pattern.
So across these modern incidents, school or workplace, the pattern holds. Perpetrators are often current or recently fired employees or students. They frequently target coworkers, former coworkers, peers, or authority figures. And the triggers. Often arguments, firings, rejections, prior disputes. It really feels like the modern Amok, maybe stripped of the ancient cultural specifics, but with that same core pattern. Perceived injustice, brooding, and then that final explosive, often self-destructive rage. Okay, pulling all this together, the ancient history, the modern patterns, it's incredibly sobering. But it also points towards something really important. These events, as awful as they aren't totally random, they aren't unpredictable, they often seem preventable. So what do we actually do? Let's start by tackling a really common and dangerous misconception. The idea that mental illness is the only cause, or even the main cause of this kind of violence.
Yeah, it is absolutely vital we debunk that myth. Because it does so much harm. It stigmatizes people and it pulls focus away from the real drivers. The reality is the vast majority of people with mental illness are not violent. In fact, solid research consistently shows only a tiny fraction, maybe 3 to 5%, of violent acts can be attributed solely to severe mental illness. That point gets profoundly lost in the public conversation, often because of sensational media coverage.
And aren't people with severe mental illness more likely to be victims?
Exactly. Counterintuitively, they're actually 10 times more likely to be victims of violent crime than the general population. It shows how vulnerable they often are and how unjust that stereotype is. So, blaming mental illness alone, it unfairly stigmatizes people who are already suffering, and it dangerously distracts us from the other critical factors that actually contribute to these complex acts.
So it's never just one thing, it's always a mix.
Always. It's a multi-causal thing. A confluence of vulnerability is not a single defect. These amok-like acts, they're typically this tragic interplay of individual psychological vulnerabilities, which might include severe, untreated mental health symptoms, like we discussed, but combined with major social factors like isolation or deep grievances, and crucially, easy access to weapons, especially firearms.
Right.
Sometimes exposure to violent media can play a role too, maybe shaping fantasies or methods. And think about those risk amplifiers we mentioned. Substance abuse is a huge one. It often doubles the risk of violence, especially for someone already struggling with mental illness, because it messes with judgment and lowers inhibitions.
And trauma.
Significant childhood trauma, physical abuse, sexual abuse, severe neglect, witnessing domestic violence that shows up in a shocking 70% of K-12 school mass shooters. It profoundly shapes development and makes people much more vulnerable to extreme distress later. And socioeconomic stressors, poverty, unemployment, housing insecurity, they can really push people closer to the edge, making them much more likely to suffer from debilitating depression and anxiety.
Okay, so given all that complexity, what does a real comprehensive prevention strategy actually look like? How do we go from understanding this mess to actually doing something?
Well, the U.S. Secret Service, based on all their research, really emphasizes that targeted violence is preventable. That's a message of hope, right?
Yeah.
Their main recommendation is using what they call multidisciplinary threat assessment teams.
What does that involve?
It means bringing together different professionals, school administrators, mental health counselors, police or SROs, social workers, maybe even lawyers to work together. Their job is to identify individuals who are showing concerning signs, whether they're students, employees, whoever. And they use a really low threshold for intervention. Better to check it out than ignore it.
And they focus on behavior, not profiles.
Exactly. The focus is assessing risk based on observable behaviors and specific circumstances, not on profiling based on demographics or stereotypes. Once they identify a potential risk, the next step is putting together tailored intervention strategies to manage that risk, provide support, and hopefully de-escalate things long before violence happens. It's about intervening early with compassion, but also decisively.
What are some of those specific interventions, things that can actually make a difference?
Several key things really stand out. First, and often the most immediate thing you can do, is rapidly restricting access to weapons, especially guns from the home, for anyone posing a clear risk. Like the Secret Service report showed, many attackers got unsecured guns from home. Safe storage is just paramount for everyone.
Okay, restrict access. What else?
Another huge one is providing really good training for everyone in the community, school staff, parents, students, police, to recognize the signs of someone in crisis. This includes practical skills like crisis intervention, managing emotions, resolving conflicts. It empowers everyone to potentially be a first responder to distress.
This is about creating this collective safety net, everyone looking out for each other.
Precisely. You need safe school and workplace climates where reporting concerning behavior is encouraged and normalized. That means having truly anonymous reporting systems people trust. It's also really important how discipline is handled. It needs to be fair and transparent. But instead of just punishment, the focus should be on staying positively engaged, even during suspension or expulsion. Connect them to support, keep communication open so they don't get more isolated or radicalized.
Makes sense.
And of course, you have to address those underlying negative home life factors and social stressors. Connecting families to social services, mentoring programs, tackling bullying head-on. Those things, persistent bullying, family breakdown, financial stress, contribute hugely to distress and have to be dealt with proactively.
Now, we can't really talk about preventing mass violence today, especially in the U.S., without getting into the really contentious issue of gun control.
No, you can't. And the data here is just stark. It really speaks for itself and shows a profound difference. The U.S. has less than 5% of the world's population, right?
Right?
But between 2000 and 2022, it experienced 31% of global public mass shootings.
31%. Wow.
Yeah. That statistic strongly suggests that the wide availability and easy access to guns, especially high-powered ones, significantly impacts the scale and deadliness of violence in the U.S. compared to elsewhere.
And the approaches to regulating guns are vastly different around the world.
Fundamentally different. You look at Germany, much of Europe, they have much stricter gun laws, often following the EU firearms directive. That means strong background checks, tough licensing, often mandatory psych evaluations for younger people wanting guns, recognizing brain development.
And the U.S.
It's way more complex and polarized here. You see states like California and New York trying to strengthen limits, add warnings, then other states like South Carolina, Louisiana moving to legalize open carry without permits, expanding gun rights. Federally, that Bipartisan Safer Communities Act in 2022 was the first big gun reform in decades. It expanded background checks for buyers under 21, restricted guns for some domestic abusers, but it fell way short of what stricter gun control advocates wanted. It just reflects those deep divisions.
Former President Obama had a famous quote about this disparity, didn't he?
He did. He put it very powerfully back in 2016. He said, "We are the only advanced country on earth that sees this kind of mass violence erupt with this kind of frequency. It doesn't happen in other advanced countries. It's not even close."
Yeah.
And that statement, backed by the data, suggests that while, yes, psychological issues and social factors are definitely involved everywhere, the availability of high-powered firearms plays a significant amplifying role in the sheer scale and lethality of these modern Amok-like events in the U.S.
Finally, there's the media's role in how these things are covered.
Yeah, responsible media reporting is incredibly important. Avoiding sensationalism is key, and maybe most importantly, not glorifying the perpetrators.
How does that happen?
When outlets focus excessively on the attacker's name, their twisted motives, their manifestos, it can inadvertently give them the notoriety some of them crave, and that might inspire copycats.
So what's the better approach?
The focus really should be on the victims, their stories, and the profound devastating impact the violence has on individuals, families, whole communities. That shifts the narrative towards healing and prevention instead of accidentally giving a platform that might fuel more tragedy.
Wow. What an intense but really insightful journey we've taken today. From those ancient warriors in a battle trance to the chilling realities of modern schools and workplaces, it's so clear that Amok isn't just some historical footnote or an isolated cultural thing.
Not at all.
It's this powerful, unsettling, but ultimately clarifying lens. It helps us understand these deeper, cross-cultural psychological patterns that drive modern targeted violence. That frenzied state, the brooding beforehand, the out-of-proportion violence, that desperate internal reaction to feeling humiliated, these threads are woven through human history and, tragically, across all cultures today.
And if there's one single takeaway from all this, it's this. These events, as devastating and shocking as they aren't random. They aren't totally unpredictable. They are almost always preceded by warning signs, by distress signals, by concerning behaviors that, if we recognize them and act on them, can lead to intervention.
They are preventable.
They are preventable. And prevention really hinges on early identification of people in distress, using comprehensive threat assessment that looks at behavior and circumstances, not just profiles, and then implementing these multifaceted interventions that courageously tackle that complex mix of psychological vulnerability, social factors, and environmental issues, including, maybe most critically, access to weapons.
So as you, our listener, reflect on this deep dive, here's something to think about. How do our societal narratives consist? The stories we tell about masculinity, about mental health, about violence itself. How do those stories shape both the acts we've discussed today and, maybe more importantly, our collective ability to actually see and respond effectively to the distress signals in our own communities? What is your role in helping foster safer environments? Not just for you, but for everyone around you, by being willing to see those signals and speak up.